There's plenty of heated debate about free speech nowadays, and as far as I can tell, almost everyone claims to be in favor of free speech, but they often mean speech from their side and not whatever those dangerous grifters are on the other side, whatever they want to say. Now, from the point of view of the brain, why do I think that free speech is worth defending? And what does this have to do with internal models, or internet indecency, or printing presses, or college campuses, or John Stuart Mill, or cultures of honor, or Robinson Crusoe, or cancel culture, why literature matters, and why free speech makes everyone safer? Welcome to Inner Cosmos with me, David Eagleman. I'm a neuroscientist and an author at Stanford. And in these episodes, we seek to understand why and how our lives look the way they do. Today, we're going to talk about free speech with lawyer and passionate advocate Greg Lukianoff. I'm a defender of free speech, but I'm not coming at this from the point of view of a political principle. Instead, I'm asserting this as a neuroscientist. And here is my argument. As you've heard me say on this podcast before, the brain operates by building an internal model of the world, which is a compressed version of reality that it uses to make predictions and help us navigate. But the thing that's not always easy to see is that our internal models are extremely limited. Your model is stitched together from the very specific details of your past experience and the influence of your hometown and the circles you spin in and the country you happen to live in and the era you happen to live in and the context of the culture you happen to be embedded in. That's how you arrive at your version of what is true and inviolable. Now, the thing that's always struck me as so interesting is why it's so hard for us to think of other points of view on any argument. It's difficult because we don't even know what to look for. We're just not smart enough most of the time to think outside the borders of our own model. And this is where free speech comes in. My interest in free speech is as illumination of ideas that live outside of your visual field. When someone expresses an idea that you hadn't considered, even one that you might find uncomfortable, they're shining a light into a corner of the map that you didn't even know was there. You didn't realize anything was missing from your map. Other people's opinions offer new pieces of the puzzle to your model. Sometimes those are corrections, sometimes just considerations of other points of view. Sometimes you'll dismiss those out of hand, and that's fine. But at least that territory now sits on your internal map, while it wasn't even there before. Without that input, your brain is just going to continue making its predictions based on partial data. We are all blind to our own blind spots. So, from this neuroscience angle, the important thing about free speech isn't just being allowed to say things, it's about the critical importance of hearing things. This is how minds stretch beyond their parochial borders. Hearing new ideas is how we push, even just by a few inches, the boundaries of our mental models. And slowly, iteratively, we start seeing other territory that we didn't know was there. If I were going to use a totally different metaphor, I might just say that friction polishes us. It's critically important to be exposed to ideas that can stretch us. Lots of the ideas that we're exposed to aren't going to do too much for us, but there's no way for us to know in advance which ones will. We are living in an age of personalization algorithms and social silos. And it seems to me the main risk of this is that we stop even encountering ideas outside our worldview. And that has big consequences for our brains, and especially for young brains, because without friction, we lose the ability to gain wisdom. As a side note, I've previously made the argument on this podcast about literature, that reading literature is so important because it allows you to go on holidays on other people's planets. In other words, it allows you to put yourself in other shoes and stand in other vantage points than the one you're used to. This is the same idea with free speech. We have to be exposed to these other vantage points. Often in this case, these are unexpected and maybe uncomfortable political points of view, but that's the only way we can expand our fence lines. Okay, so that all sounds good, but the problem is that free speech triggers a lot of discomfort. Listening to someone defend opposing ideas is an unnatural act for the brain because it asks us to entertain ideas that we might hate. It makes us defensive. It sometimes asks us to sit with cognitive dissonance. It asks us to admit that we are not perfect in our own views and that sometimes we are wrong. But is it important to build some cognitive flexibility? Well, just look at the history of science where every new idea was very unpopular to begin with, whether that's the sun at the center of the orbit instead of the Earth, or the idea that we and other animals evolved through time, or Einstein's theory of relativity. Every single advance in science triggers a lot of pushback before it gains acceptance. We tell the story of Galileo fighting the church, but there's a sense in which we could equally cast it as a fight against the brain's instinct to preserve the status quo. But, especially in recent years, it seems like something has shifted. On campuses and on social platforms and in institutions, we have seen the rise of emotional reasoning, the belief that if something doesn't match your internal model, it's offensive. Maybe the words are equated to violence, and therefore the speech has to be shut down. And it's no surprise because when you're confronted with ideas that you don't like, your limbic system is cranked up and that steers your reactions. The ancient alarm bells that we have, including, for example, the amygdala, these circuits don't distinguish so well between a snake and a sentence that we don't like. And who wants their sense of what's true to feel threatened? So today we're going to talk about all this and why it matters, and I'm so happy to be joined by my colleague, Greg Lukianoff, who is a constitutional lawyer and a passionate, lifelong free speech advocate. We're going to talk about the benefits of free speech, including several that don't often strike us. Greg is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, known as FIRE, and this organization is very creative in how it defends freedom of speech. They use lawsuits and videos and documentaries and books. And in fact, you might know him from his co-authored books, The Coddling of the American Mind, and more recently, The Canceling of the American Mind. And also, he recently gave a TED Talk exploring how we've come to equate words with violence and how this shift might be doing more harm than good, especially to young minds. So here's my interview with Greg. Greg, you care a lot about free speech. How did you get here?
Well, I went to Stanford for law school right down the road, and I went to law school to do First Amendment freedom of speech. My family on my Russian side, fled the Soviets, and I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of other first-generation kids. So we really took free speech very seriously because a lot of us came from countries that didn't have it. So that definitely that'll give you that real fire in your belly about it.
And you grew up in a diverse community as well, right?
I did, yeah. There are a lot of kids from China, a lot of kids from Vietnam, a lot of kids from South America.
And therefore everyone had different opinions.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, they had different opinions, but they also, one thing that they tended to have in common was that back home they didn't allow free speech.
Aha, yeah.
Or at least not much of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so you went to law school and you thought, I'm going to really concentrate on free speech. Okay.
I took every class Stanford offered on freedom of speech. When I ran out, I did 6 credits on censorship in the Tudor dynasty because I'm a nerd. And then I interned at the ACLU of Northern California up in San Francisco.
Aha. Wait, give me just 1 second about what the Tudor dynasty had to do with free speech.
It was so great. Because the printing press is kind of like, was the first big disruptive technology of kind of like, modernity. And And Henry VIII was reacting in response to what the printing press was bringing to England. He wanted to have a control over printing in all of England. So there was these print licensing laws that he basically, the only way you were allowed to print in England was using a printing press that was owned by a company that he approved of, which was a smart way to do censorship kind of on the cheap. And so Henry, was no friend of freedom of speech. And Elizabeth wasn't really great either. She did have some people, maimed, for example, for free speech.
Got it. So the idea is they wanted to control the presses so that they could control the message. Yeah, and this is what's in common with essentially all countries that try to control free speech. They work on the presses. I mean, for example, in the Soviet Union, that was the thing. You control the newspapers, you control the weather reports, you control everything.
Yep.
And so I have a quick tangential question, which is, how did the invention of the internet change the ability for governments to do that?
Oh, that's so cool. That was the thing that got me the most excited about going to law school to study freedom of speech. It was something called the Communications Decency Act in the Telecom Act of 1996. And it was trying to ban indecency on the internet, not obscenity, indecency. And indecency is like lewdness, whatever that's supposed to mean. And I remember studying this in undergrad and being like, this is laughably unconstitutional. This is way too broad. This is way too vague. And so that's what I went to law school to fight.
So you gave a TED Talk recently, a great TED Talk, where you outlined 4 reasons why you are an opinion absolutist.
Yes.
Now, we actually, just to back up for 1 second, you're not a free speech absolutist because there are, in fact, limits to free speech. And actually give us a very short sense of that. In America, what are the limits on free speech?
Sure. So, for example, incitement to imminent lawless action, basically saying in a situation where you're likely to burn down the mayor's office, let's go burn down the mayor's office, for example. Defamation is not protected, but defamation has a very particular definition that is essentially, it's not saying you're a jerk. It's saying, I know for a fact this person's a pedophile.
Right.
It's an accusation of something serious, and it's a factual accusation, not opinion. And of course, the protections that we have in place to make sure that it's very hard to get sued for defamation if you're defaming, say, the president of the United States, is one of the reasons why I'm okay with defamation as a category of unprotected speech, because we have very good protections to keep it from getting out of hand. Obscenity is not protected, but that doesn't mean it's normal meaning in regular human English. It basically means hardcore porn. So that's not protected, but most places, allow it as long as it's kind of controlled, as long as they can keep kids off of it, for example. Child pornography is never protected under any circumstances. Got no issue with that. So basically, as a rule of thumb, the things that make speech unprotected are things that start to look a lot more like parts of crimes, for example, like incidental parts of crimes. The fact that you use words to say your money or your life, who cares? That doesn't give a First Amendment person a second's pause. But things that tend to look more like patterns of behavior, like harassment, for example, which is why I make the distinction of being an opinion absolutist, which is essentially, I think there's value in knowing what people's opinions are always, full stop.
Right, because otherwise you don't know who you're hanging out with in your community or your university or in your population in terms of what they really think.
But also from a scientific standpoint, it is valuable to know. The example that I gave in my talk was that no, lizard people who live under the Denver airport do not, in fact, control the world. But knowing that your future husband thinks they do, knowing that your congressman thinks they do, or every single person in your new city thinks they do, is really important information to have about your world.
Exactly right. And so you made the argument that free speech makes you safer.
Yes.
So give us a sense of that.
So free speech makes you safer is this idea that you're not safer for knowing less about what people really think. It can give you the illusion of safety, that essentially nobody's saying Nazi things around me. But if it's illegal to say that, here's what you actually do. And this goes a little deeper than I had time to go on my TED Talk. Group polarization is about one of the best documented, findings in social science is if you get people who politically agree with each other to talk to just each other, they come back more radicalized in the direction of the group. And this is, you can simulate this, it replicates easily. You take, a dozen people, figure out where they are politically, split them right down the middle, have them go talk about a hot button issue that they agree on. They will come back much more radicalized in the direction of the group. And we end up doing that in censorship because essentially censorship means, and I said this on the Bill Maher show, we don't have laws against anti-Semitic speech in the United States, but they have had them in Europe for decades. And anti-Semitism, has really increased in Europe over those same decades in a way that it hasn't, more recently it certainly seems to be going up, but over the past several decades, it hasn't had the same kind of curve. And my point there was...
In America, you mean?
In America,
okay.
But it has in Europe, because it's gotten really bad in Europe. And what I said was, it's like you passed a law that basically said anti-Semites can only talk to other anti-Semites. So what did you expect to happen?
Okay, so the first one is, if people are putting all their cards on the table, you have more knowledge about what's going on.
Yep.
Okay, and the reason this makes a lot of sense is because we have these very limited internal models, which we take to be the truth. We say, look, here's my view of the world. I know that's truth. I know that's correct. And I don't know what all those other idiots and trolls are doing out there, but I know that I have the right answer.
Yeah.
And it's only when you're exposed to those other points of view that you might even scratch at the fence lines of your internal model and start pushing it around and seeing what else is happening there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it makes you smarter as well as safer to be able to understand, there's very different views here on this.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, most discussions aren't truth-seeking discussions. A lot of times when people defend free speech, they only talk about the situation in which you're trying to figure out what the world actually looks like. And I'm trying to make the point that even when you say things just about preference, you're saying something important about the world. Like that I'm willing to pay $1 billion for a really good wine is very important information to have if you're selling wine, for example. But when it comes to truth-seeking arguments, this is one of the reasons why. I mean, John Stuart Mill, the guy was a freaking genius. He was speaking Greek at 3. Like wow. he was off the charts. And I coined this term called Mill's trident because he makes this argument in On Liberty, 1859, same year as Origin of Species, very cool year.
Nice.
And the 3 things are that in a truth-seeking argument, there are only 3 possibilities. 1, you're wrong. 2, you're partially right, partially wrong. And 3, you're completely right. And he makes the point that free speech matters in all 3 circumstances. Obviously, if you're wrong, the much more, you're not going to know you're wrong until someone can challenge it. Second, if you're partially right, then even more so, because then you'll actually refine your opinion. And people have this experience every day where you're like, oh yeah, okay, right, okay. You change yourself a little bit on that. But even if, God forbid, you're entirely right, it's because you don't understand why you believe it in the first place until you have to defend this. And I see this all the time on college campuses. These people who I agree with politically, I'm a political liberal, but they don't know how to defend a lot of what they believe because they hold them, as Mill referred to it as, the way people hold prejudices. They know they believe the right things, but they don't really know why because they've never had to defend it.
So your second argument was that free speech actually protects you from violence. Unpack that for us.
Yeah. So free speech is an alternative to violence. So most of human history was spent in there's this idea of different sort of moral cultures. And one of the most ancient forms of a moral culture is something called a culture of honor, where essentially the idea is that to a degree, it's up to you to protect your property, to protect your family, and to protect your reputation. And that's a serious sort of property interest you have in that, but also a serious moral obligation you have. Now, in societies where
Can I just get something straight? You mean moral in the sense that because you need to protect these things and you're on your own, that gets written into what you believe equals morality? As in, if I'm a moral person, I'm going to defend my sister's reputation to the death. Is that what you mean by?
Well, I think it's both. I think that in more ancient societies, essentially like this idea that essentially like an eye for an eye kind of idea was actually an idea of sort of limiting the damage. And people forget this about eye for an eye. Like it sounds so horrible. But really what they're saying is, listen, if someone wrongs you and they take your eye out, you can only get one eye back. You can't destroy their entire village. And because that's how brutal, it was in some of the older times. So this idea of a culture of honor, is still pretty typical in a lot of societies. But that is often resorting to violence in response to defending yourself. Cultures of dignity are ideas that actually came sort of right around the time of the Enlightenment and with democratic societies, where essentially the rules are there is legitimate authority, there's a legitimate use of force out there, and it's up to you to be able to handle some amount of insult, some amount of abrasion, and hold on to your own dignity, and you are not allowed to resort to violence. So when on campus, and I ran into this, it's gotten a little bit better, but definitely over the last 10 years, I've seen this a lot, this argument that essentially if you're saying something really offensive, that's a form of violence. So like, for example, at Cornell a couple of years ago, Ann Coulter was invited to speak. Now, I don't agree with her politics, but Ann Coulter is trying to shock and annoy you. Like she cracks jokes about being like, I couldn't believe I can make money just by, spewing right-wing vitriol. Like that's her shtick. She's going to try to anger you if you're on the left. And students showed up, though. They shouted her down. They wouldn't let her talk. And they said, your words are violence. And this is something I've heard over and over again, like in response to the Milo Yiannopoulos riots. How many articles were written at Berkeley by students saying, well, his speech was violence.
Give us background on that real fast.
Oh, Milo Yiannopoulos, not a nice guy. Milo Yiannopoulos was a right-wing provocateur. And he was going to speak at Berkeley, and then an angry mob showed up, Antifa, and they started a riot, and it did something like $500,000 of damage. They burned things. Like people, there was one guy who really should have died because they hit him with a flagpole. Like it was bad. Now, to be clear, a lot of the people who were hurt weren't even fans of Milo Yiannopoulos. They were bystanders who were just there during this riot. And things like this happen on campus. They're shameful, in my opinion. But what was really different about this was after those riots, students wrote pieces justifying the student violence as saying, well, Milo's speech was violence, so our violence was self-defense. And I make the point, it's like, well, welcome back to the 13th century. This is not a new idea. This is an ancient idea, and an ancient bad idea that leads to a spiral of violence a la Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's one of those things. It's a very bad ancient idea. So I made the point also of this metaphor of speech being like violence. I talk about, I got punched out randomly at a party. I'd done nothing, and I got assaulted, and I was so badly hurt. I couldn't see out of this eye for a month. I got a concussion, and I had a friend stabbed in the chest, like right here, and so like also at a moral level. So
you're saying that's real violence. Yeah, that's words are not real violence.
Yeah, words are not real violence. And words are our best replacement for violence because you have to have a system for resolving conflict. No conflict is totalitarianism. Yeah. You have to have a system for resolving conflict. The way we used to do it, overwhelmingly, threats of violence or actual violence. Harsh words being harsh sometimes should be expected when you're replacing actual violence.
So let me come back to this issue of totalitarianism because it feels to me like at the heart of the problem is the fact that a lot of people feel if you were to really push them, they feel like, maybe we should have a totalitarianism in the sense that everyone should agree with me. I know that I'm right.
Yeah.
So if I have a government structure in place that says, look, everyone do my opinion on this, then that would be a great government.
Yeah.
So do you find that part of your job is changing people's opinion about that issue of, wouldn't it be great if the whole world agreed with me and we had a totalitarian government that just put that into place?
Yeah, that's my Sisyphean job, is to roll that ball up the hill every day and be like, listen, there are ridiculous advantages to free societies. And of course, I could just go with the argument, essentially like freedom is good just because it's good. And that's a little bit of the natural law argument, essentially like the idea, the human rights argument, that essentially we just need to take for granted that this is a good thing.
Okay, but you're saying that's not the good argument. What's the good argument?
The good argument is that free societies are better by virtually every measure, and that human diversity is something that actually has huge benefit.
And you mean diversity in terms of opinion in this case?
Yes, all sorts of diversity. Like,
yeah, that's right.
But also diversity in terms of opinions, but also norms, also culture, also preference, all personality. Like having the big 5 personality traits be distributed throughout society, I think is actually a wonderful thing. But there can be this, and this is the totalitarian temptation, that essentially, if everybody thought like me, everything would be fine. And this is why I wrote a talk called "Fight the Guardians." Because I'm pretty hard on Plato's Republic, because I think Plato was really actually, it wasn't a metaphor for the soul. He was actually talking about, if clever people like me were in charge, human evil would just go away, everything would be swell. And I'm a little bit like, when clever people get a lot of power, the track record has not been so great,
Give us some examples.
Lenin, I think about why my family had to flee the Soviet Union. I think about Lenin, Stalin. Certainly the Nazis thought they were clever, and they were obviously some of the greatest monsters in human history. So I think that there's something to be said for systems that actually allow regular people a voice, that protect human freedom, that make it very hard to vote away human rights.
And I imagine you would argue that the study of history is part of what teaches us this, because both on the left and the right, communists on the one hand, fascists, Nazis on the other hand, you've got people who say, look, here's my really good argument why everyone should listen to me.
Yeah.
And that always ends up in disaster.
Yeah.
And I assume you would argue that when you look at democratic societies with lots of fighting about opinion, despite all the disadvantages, they end up faring better.
They end up faring well. They have better wealth, innovation, happiness, all of these things. And we have this, and we, unfortunately, we have to learn this lesson over and over again. Like reading, some of the literature from World War I, for example. There was skepticism about liberalism, going into World War I, and liberal societies did much better in World War I than people expected. They thought a monarchical system was going to have this huge advantage. So it is largely
advantage in the war.
In the war.
I see what you're saying. Okay, but in fact, the liberal societies did fine in the war, in fact, won the war.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I see.
Partially because they were more innovative, they were more prosperous, they had actual genuine advantages. But that was more from a material kind of standpoint, the liberalism one. It was after World War II that you had this, and it's weird reading Supreme Court opinions from after World War II. There's this idea that liberalism was dying and that the future may belong to communism, for example. Like some kind of totalitarian ideology might actually win in the end. There was tremendous pessimism about liberal and free societies actually succeeding. But then we had 1989 and 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union. We had the fall of Eastern Europe. We got to see that essentially, once again, liberalism, emphasizing, freedom, individuality, all these things. It's a very powerful system. It's a more robust system than we sometimes give it credit for. But does that mean that's always going to be the case? I don't know. And my job is to be the person defending it, for the rest of my life.
If you and I were to have this conversation 1,000 years from now, we might look back and say, wow, the American experiment failed and it turns out some other thing worked better.
Yeah.
But as far as we can tell right now, you're going to take this position of saying, I'm going to defend free speech and all the rest of what goes into having a free society. And I'm going to assume for the moment that this is the best case because historically it seems to have proven itself.
Yeah, historically it seems to have proven itself. I think that but I do believe in the moral argument for it.
Tell me the moral argument.
That essentially it's a good idea to think that anybody who has like a mind or a soul should have some certain rights attached. That essentially you should not be able to torture them. They should be allowed to say what they think. They should not be deprived of things without actually some kind of process in place, so it can't just be arbitrarily taken away from them. All of these, and I picked on natural rights a little bit, but I always point out that natural rights are human rights, like that essentially this theory, and it was an idea of trying to figure out if God is rational, what rights would he have naturally attached to us? And it's a persuasive argument from a moral standpoint that essentially everybody is owed these things as a society. Now, is it a societal agreement? Yeah, I don't believe in God, so I don't believe there is someone actually deciding this, but I do believe it's a good and smart societal agreement to have a more just society.
Okay, so your third argument in your TED Talk was that free speech defends the powerless.
Yeah.
So unpack that for us.
Now this is, I opened up by talking about my frustration with the younger crop of students I've been dealing with. Because keep in mind, I've been doing this, I'm old. Like I've been defending free speech, at FIRE for 23 years now. Right. I started right after I got out of law school. And I started running into students, who increasingly seemed to believe that free speech was the argument of the three Bs: the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron. And I had to explain, that's bad history. Because here's the thing. The robber baron, the rich and powerful, don't need special protections for free speech because they have wealth and power. They do okay. A lot of representative government was the king asking the merchant class for money. Like the rich and powerful did okay. And when it comes to democratic societies, if you're a bully or a bigot and your society is bullying and bigoted, if you have enough votes, though, you still get to call the shots. And so literally, the only people who need the special protections of something like the First Amendment or freedom of speech are people who are either unpopular with power or unpopular with the majority. And this is why, people like Frederick Douglass, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Ida B. Wells, they all were champions of freedom of speech because they realized that minority rights, whether you mean that in numerical minority or racial minority or opinion minority for that matter, they're the ones who need freedom of speech. And I think this lesson gets lost in the monoculture of campuses, where essentially it tends to be so sort of politically shifted that you can actually convince yourself of free speech is the argument of the bad guys. But that's a very typical thing that people tend to think once they have a lot of power, is that essentially, well, yeah, I believed in free speech when I wasn't powerful, but I don't know.
Well, you have, before we get on to the fourth one, you have seen a shift in what's happening on college campuses over the course of time that you've been running FIRE. What happened?
Yeah, no, that was, well, first of all, when I started in 2001, it was easier to get in trouble for what you said than I expected on campus. Like that was a genuine surprise because I was dealing with a backlog of case submissions that came in from years before when the founders of FIRE actually wrote a book on the situation on campus. But mostly it was administrators who were sort of pushing people around, but in truly ridiculous cases. Like an early case, for example, was this case of Keith John Sampson at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. He was a working class dude. He was working his way through school as a janitor, and he was reading a book called Notre Dame versus the Klan. This is a book about the fact that the Klan marched on Notre Dame because they were also anti-Catholic in the 1920s, and that Notre Dame students got together and kicked their asses. Like it celebrates the defeat of the Klan in a giant street fight. But because it had pictures of that actual rally, on the cover, and an employee saw the pictures, he was found guilty without a hearing, without knowing who was charging him. He was found guilty of racial harassment because it made an employee feel uncomfortable. Now, people always like point out, it's kind of like, well, you'd be singing another tune if you saw someone reading Mein Kampf or something. And I'm like, okay, listen, it's protected to read offensive books, and it should be. It's just more ironic that he was reading an anti-racist book. It makes it that much more, are you kidding me? Kind of thing. But those were always administrators over enforcing, sometimes really stupidly, some of these rules. It was only around when I started working with Haidt that I started noticing large numbers of students having this attitude about free speech as well. And that was around 2013, 2014. And that's when I got together with Haidt, and I'd had issues with anxiety and depression. I studied cognitive behavioral therapy. I had a breakdown in 2007. And as I was recovering, and I'm learning all these tactics for talking back to the exaggerations in your brain, I'm watching what's going on campus and being like, why are the adults seemingly telling all the young people to overgeneralize, to catastrophize, to engage in all these cognitive distortions that I knew that if you didn't talk back to them or talk them down rather than talking them up, you will be anxious and depressed, even if you're not prone to it. But it was only around 2013, 2014 that I started noticing students showing up on campus actually thinking like this. And I approached Haidt.
Thinking like what?
Thinking that essentially if this person speaks on my campus, it's going to be psychologically harmful, usually not to me, but to some huge portion of it's going to be a catastrophe.
Oh, I see.
And that essentially if I feel aversion to it, this is emotional reasoning, that must mean that something has to be done about it. That there's fortune telling, that essentially it will result in some kind of permanent psychological harm to people. All of this kind of distorted thinking. And I went to John and I was like, listen, if this is true, there's two things are going to happen. It's going to be a disaster for academic freedom and free speech because it's going to be an environment where it's just too easy for people to get in trouble and they're going to clam up. And two, it's going to be disaster for the mental health of the young people who believe this stuff. Because if you actually believe that that essentially you're constantly in danger, you're easily harmed by words or ideas, that's a very cruel thing to teach somebody because it's setting them up for pain, more pain than they would have if they just kind of accepted the idea that, there's going to be the jerks in the world. And unfortunately, and this is the 10th year anniversary of the article, Coddling the American Mind, that I wrote with Haidt back in 2015, and things did get a lot worse on campus.
So what happened? Why did they get so much worse? I mean, and I think many of us in the early 2020s felt like, wow, things are really insane.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I saw it coming a long way out because you could kind of see some of this coming when you saw what was happening on campus. I think there are a lot of factors going on. I think that some of it are kind of like natural progression, that essentially if something becomes more politically homogenous, it tends to actually get more radicalized. But I definitely think the thing that sped everything up was social media. The students who were showing up on campus in 2013, 2014 were the first generation of students to grow up with smartphones in their pockets. And they'd kind of perfected this way of arguing in junior high school, where essentially it was very moralistic, but it was also very nasty. Essentially, like I can defeat you, I can cancel you.
Oh, it gave them a new tool.
Yeah,
to be able to cancel somebody. I see.
And those students met a cohort of administrators who were already there, who'd been the people I'd been fighting before. So it wasn't just the students showed up. It was the students met this bureaucratic middle management level that kind of saw its job as policing offense on campus. And that's partially encouraged by some poorly written laws that come out of the Department of Education. There's a lot of things meeting at once. But so Coddling the American Mind, that whole book is what was so different about the students hitting campus in 2014. And we call it a social science detective story. There's even things about, parenting in there. Those are some of my favorite chapters in the book. We talk about polarization and about lack of viewpoint diversity can make that worse. But we also talk about the peculiarity of campuses as mega businesses, and the customer is always right mentality that makes that worse to a degree, but also ideological assumptions, that are very much the very, very black or white morality. When we talk about intersectionality, for example, in the book. Perfectly fine idea from Kimberly Crenshaw, if you understand it as just being this simple idea. The oppression faced by someone who has, multiple axes of oppression, or more simply, the problems that they face are probably going to be different than the problem that someone who was, and the way she described this is the problems faced by black women on the job are different than those faced by black men. No question, accurate. But when it starts taking on a sort of moral idea, when you start actually seeing life just split into a simple morality tale of good oppressed versus bad oppressors, and that's really based in immutable characteristics, that's... I'm not very complimentary towards this idea. I think this is a wild oversimplification of very much more complicated realities about human nature, about what society is actually like. But I think if you have that kind of like good versus evil kind of mentality, you do end up in a place where that's not that conducive for knowledge creation, for debate, for discussion, etc. If you know for a fact that that person who disagrees with you, they're not just wrong, they're bad people.
Yeah. We're so hardwired for this sort of thing in terms of good and evil. I mean, all our stories, all the fairy tales, all the Star Wars movies, everything is about good versus evil. Every way that we tell stories about wars that our country has fought in, whichever country we're in, we tell the story of the bad guys on the other side and the good guys on our side. So how do we escape that?
It's not easy. It's one of those things, just like knowledge creation and knowing the world as it is an arduous, never-ending process of revision and relearning. And I think that one of the best things you can do for this, and I wrote a book as a follow-up to Coddling the American Mind with this brilliant young woman named Ricky Schlott called Canceling the American Mind. And we talked about the antidote for cancel culture is basically what we call free speech culture. And trying to sort of like to simply explain what it means to have a free speech culture, I realized that a lot of the idioms that we would have grown up with, but younger people haven't so much grown up with. And we just did a survey on this, by the way. I'm writing something about this for my Substack called The Eternally Radical Idea, about how often people use things like to each their own, not my cup of tea, don't judge a book by its cover, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. All these things we said a lot as a kid, and we thought they were just, everybody agreed on that, right? Everyone's entitled to their opinion. I don't have to like it, but I haven't walked a mile in your shoes, so I can't really judge you. And I think that those are great sayings for a culture of dignity, for a culture in which you actually are expected to listen. I want you to respect my autonomy, but I have to respect your autonomy to a degree too. And that's something that has to be learned and experienced.
So do you think those expressions that we grew up with have changed, have dropped out of the parlance?
According to the survey, at least young people seem to be familiar with them. They just don't use them very often. The one that was least well known was judge the argument, not the person. That was probably the one that they knew the least, which makes some amount of sense when you see kind of the problems today. But my co-author, Ricky, who was 20 when I started working with her, she said, I didn't hear these at all growing up. Wow. And that was really, another one is it's a free country, which was a wise ass often way of saying, but it's kind of like, I'm allowed to do what I want to do here. It's a free country. I can wear this hat.
Right. And importantly, we would say that when we see someone else doing something you think is crazy.
And
right?
So we'll check you, because so many of what's in those sayings is the most important thing that I have to convey. So sometimes, since I have a 7 and a 9-year-old, people will say, "Okay, Mr. Free Speech, how do you deal with that when you have kids?" And I'm like, "Well, I teach them the most important thing about freedom of speech, which is epistemic humility, which is knowing that in the grand scheme of things, you don't know that much." And all of these sayings They're about, dude, you're not omniscient. You don't know everything. You can't know everything. And it's also not your place to judge everybody else.
Yeah.
And this is so well sort of like in social science and neuroscience, kind of like in psychology, like the illusion of explanatory depth, like all of these kind of like ideas about like how much we overestimate how much we think we actually know and understand.
Just for the listenership, the illusion of explanatory depth is we think we know things and we assume we know them all the way down. So if I say to you, you know, hey, do you know how the Electoral College works? And you say, yeah. And I say, hey, can you explain it to me? And you say, well, actually, hold on. Maybe I'm not clear on this. But we do this with everything, where whatever knowledge we have, it's often like a Potemkin village where we just see the front piece of the houses and we don't actually know what's behind it. But it's only when we scratch the surface that we realize, oh, I don't actually know that piece.
Yeah.
This to me seems like the heart of it, this epistemic humility.
Yes.
Because the fact is, for every one of us, the most clever person among us, our knowledge is a Potemkin village. There are many things we don't know. There are many points of view we've never even considered or thought about.
Yeah.
And yet we always have the illusion that, okay, I know the truth. This is clear to me.
Yeah.
And so this is why, from a neural point of view, I believe so strongly in free speech. It's because of the need. It's because of the, what's a new term I could use here? The epistemic stretching that's needed.
Yeah.
All the time, because you simply can't see all the things that you don't know until someone challenges you on it. And then as this was Daniel Defoe in Robinson Crusoe said, I'm not gonna get this quite right, but it said something like, you can never understand anything except by its contraries. And so the idea is you need to get to the other side of something to say, oh, okay, now I understand this. I see the landscape here. Now I can make a decision on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, epistemic humility is the whole ball game, and I think that it's something that I read this in Yuval Harari. He summarized this idea was by saying that essentially we should refer to the Enlightenment as the discovery of ignorance, because that's what was so brilliant about it. Is we started testing all of these folk traditions. A lot of our intuitions are just wrong.
Yeah.
When you actually test them.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the great. I mean, I always think with the majesty of Newton admitting he didn't know how gravity worked and he had no actual explanation for it. Like, that's a moment of sort of like intellectual restraint that we benefited from for the rest of human history.
You know, this is what I have always loved about science, is that everybody, when you write a paper, you say, look, I don't know this is a hypothesis, so on. Scientists never talk about truth. It's just a word that scientists don't use. People often misquote scientists and say, well, it's been scientifically proven that X, Y, Z, or the scientific, the truth is X, Y, Z. But we never use those words because all you ever have is the weight of evidence suggesting A over B and C and D for the moment. It's provisional.
Yeah.
And so this is a style of learning and of discussion I think is massively important, and I'm surprised often that hasn't seeped further into culture.
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing to live with. I remember talking to someone who was religious, and he couldn't. He actually was genuinely skeptical that I could actually draw great satisfaction from doubt. And I remember, and it was a beautiful moment, and it's something that someone might be afraid to say to me in a situation in which the speech norms were too much like don't offend each other, because he might have thought he was offending me. But I was like, oh my God, that no, I don't think you understand. I mean, like awe, like the experience of not knowing is one of the most profoundly wonderful experiences sometimes, and just that give you the chills. But it's a mentality, and it's not, and that's like another reason why I like human diversity. There are people who look at the sky and feel sad and small, and there's others of us who feel wonderful and small.
Yeah, that's exactly right. What science does is replace the feeling of certainty with the feeling of awe. Yeah, because you get to understand, wow, this is actually much bigger than I am. It's not that I can just look in this holy book book from my deity and see this is the answer, that's the answer, and so on, but instead say, oh boy, this is a big cosmos.
It's funny, like when people like just dismiss, they'll talk about kind of like the majesty of like the way we used to believe the world worked as opposed to like this cold scientific thing, like as if the way we used to explain it wasn't more mind-blowing than the way it actually is.
Lord. Okay, so I want to return to your TED Talk and your fourth argument, which was that even bad people can have good ideas. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's something that when you watch the way people debate, like on social media, so much of it is to try to prove that someone else is bad, as if that was the same thing as proving that they are wrong. And I really have to get people to remember these two things are not related. And I give the example of Wernher von Braun, who I'm kind of like, oh yeah, he got us to the moon. Also, he was a Nazi. He believed horrible things. I think he recanted some of it later, but still, he was a Nazi. But then there are people like Thomas Malthus, who was reportedly a very nice man, but Malthusian kind of ideas of scarcity were used, and that an overpopulation were used to justify mass sterilizations. They're used to justify mass starvations, how the negative effect of Malthusianism on human flourishing is hard to overstate. So being a good person doesn't mean you're right, and being a bad person doesn't mean you're wrong. And that should sound obvious, but we hate this fact. There's even that meme of like worst person actually right about something.
I hadn't heard that meme. You know what this reminds me of is Lord George Gordon in England in the 1700s. He was a guy who had a lot of empathy for other people. He really cared about the rights of the sailors. So he was born into some level of nobility. Yeah. But he really cared about the sailors and their rights. And when they took a ship to Jamaica, he berated the governor there, the British governor, about the rights of the locals because he felt like they were getting treated badly, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay, this is what he was famous for a while. But what he's really famous for in history is that he ended up leading the Gordon riots because he hated his Catholic neighbors. He had such antipathy for Catholics that he led the largest ever domestic upheaval in London's history, where the Gordon riots were, something like 20,000 people who marched through the streets and burned Catholic churches and burned Catholic homes.
Wow.
People are complex, and it matters what the particular opinion in question is, as opposed to what else they've done. Yeah. What role do you suppose cognitive discomfort plays in intellectual development?
Oh, I think it's essential. And this is actually one of the reasons why I'm worried about the future of freedom of speech. So Steve Pinker is a friend, and I know you know him as well. He's a wonderful, lovely man. And at the same time, I tend to be a little bit more pessimistic about the future of free speech. And he's much more sort of optimistic about where society is heading. Now, to be clear, Steve is making the argument with a caveat, as long as we don't forget what actually works and we don't let ideology get in the way. He's very clear about that.
Yeah.
But I make the point that there are certain types of things that I called in a very short book that I wrote called Freedom from Speech, called Problems of Comfort, that there are things that get worse precisely because other things are getting better. And free speech, inquiry, being wrong, all of these things that are essential for intellectual development, essential for getting closer to the truth, are unpleasant in a lot of ways, particularly if you're not used to them. They can be highly unpleasant. If you get super used to them, they can actually be just fine. Yeah. But that's a mentality you have to cultivate. And I think that as societies get more comfortable, as it's easier, as we become more affluent, and as we're able to surround ourselves with AI voices that tell us we're right about everything and suck up to us all the time, and we live in neighborhoods where people don't disagree all that much, that essentially you shouldn't be surprised that people's appreciation for free speech starts going down. So I actually think that free speech issues are going to get worse over time precisely because other things are getting better. And I think that that's very concerning, particularly at this moment when we're kind of designing what's going to be sort of the epistemic operating system for the planet. This is a time when we need to
Meaning AI in this
AI,
case.
oh, yeah. Sorry, yeah. That we have to be kicking the tires on what we think is true harder now more than ever, because I think that we need more friction in knowledge creation than we currently have.
I'll tell you my take on AI. I feel like we're in a golden age of AI right now, which is to say, if you ask, let's say, ChatGPT some question like, is Donald Trump a good president?
Yeah.
What you'll get is a pretty nuanced argument. Like some people think yes, some people think no. Here's some arguments for and against, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
A lot of people are annoyed by this. The fact is that's great because what we're going to face in the future, I'm predicting, is a balkanization of AI, where the liberals say, we don't want any of this literature in there. We're just going to train on our literature. And the conservatives are going to say, we're going to get rid of all that stuff. We're going to just train on our literature. And you're going to start getting AIs that just present a particular point of view. And I think that's inevitable. That's right around the corner.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a real loss.
Yeah.
In terms of this epistemic stretching that we're talking about. You just won't even get to hear the other point of view.
Well, then like actually a project that FIRE is doing, my organization is doing with the Cosmos Institute, where we actually put $250,000 of our own money into a $1 million pool to give spot grants for people to develop basically epistemically humble AI, things that actually promote freedom of speech, that promote critical thinking, because we're worried about precisely this thing too. And it comes in part from one idea, like overly broad ideas of AI alignment that are kind of, if you're basically like, this AI must say nothing that offends anybody, that's pretty bad. But also the fact that it wants to suck up to you in so many cases. It's like, tell me how I make you happy.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a problem. So believe me, like, and I make the point, if we get the AI thing wrong, that's kind of the whole ball game.
Oh boy. Because your take is, if we then have future college students who get a sycophantic AI that says, yep, you're exactly right in your opinion about that, and does not challenge them, that's where we really go downhill. That was my interview with Greg Lukianoff, who, by the way, has a new book out called The War on Words. And our conversation gives us insight, I hope, not only into law and politics, but also into the relationship between the internal model of the brain and how we want to structure our society. At the heart of the issue is that our inner circuitry, which is evolved for tribal cohesion and emotional immediacy and rapid threat detection, this collides with the demands of a pluralistic, idea-rich culture. And at the center of this collision is speech. Now, as I said at the beginning, when I think about free speech, I'm not thinking about the right to speak, but about the importance of hearing. Practice with listening to free speech expands the fence lines of our internal models. It teaches us to process disagreement without falling apart. It teaches us to engage in ideas rather than to retreat. It teaches us to hold competing ideas in tension. This is, to my mind, probably the most important thing about going off to college. The details of your classes you're going to forget after a while, but the important skill you learn is how to process ideas that challenge and stretch your presumptions. Now, I'm not saying that just because someone has a different idea that you'll come to agree with it, but allowing ourselves to be challenged by ideas has the possibility of improving our points of view. It can illuminate for each of us a different angle on a topic that we've just never thought of. And in the best case, from the point of view of plasticity, it will ever so slightly change our brains. And even if it doesn't shift your views at all, even if you stick with your original position, just listening to the genuine but differing beliefs of someone else is going to sharpen your point of view and make the thing that you believe in more worth believing in. If you never challenge your belief system, your opinions will always be lightweight. The challenge, of course, is that disagreement feels dangerous. We want certainty, and when we encounter ideas that contradict our worldview, our stress hormones rise, our prefrontal cortex, the seat of reflection, is often bypassed in favor of older, faster systems. So being exposed to other viewpoints requires a cognitive stretch. It asks us to become aware of our own reactivity. It asks us to sit, as Viktor Frankl once said, in the space between stimulus and response, and to choose something new. And this is how we build meaningful resilience. It comes from experience with a lot of friction, from learning to metabolize difference rather than simply being afraid of it. And this is where education enters the picture, not just on campuses, but every place we interact with new ideas. Libraries, dinner tables, inboxes, these are the arenas where our brains get to practice the art of tolerating difference and nuance. Greg Lukianoff has long argued that if we want a society capable of navigating complexity, we need to build psychological anti-fragility. What that means is that challenge strengthens rather than weakens. And neuroscience gives us every reason to believe this is possible. The brain is flexible, and one can learn to override the deep pathways of reactivity in favor of curiosity and patience and discernment. So I'd encourage you to find some conversation that you don't agree with, or a book that you wouldn't normally read. It may or may not change your mind on something, even a tiny bit. But every argument we address with genuine attention is an opportunity to wire a better brain. Go to eagleman.com/podcast for more information and to find further reading. Join the weekly discussions on my Substack, and check out and subscribe to Inner Cosmos on YouTube for videos of each episode and to leave comments. Until next time, I'm David Eagleman, and this is Inner Cosmos.